Good morning, and we are sponsored today. Our live event is by the PFAFF Sewing Machine Company, so we're going to be sewing on the Creative Icon 2. Today's project is the Topaz Treasure, and you can download that pattern by following the link that is in the chat portion, just like you do every time you join me. And we can then collect up our fabrics. Let's talk about what we're creating. Now, some of you will look at this and go, that looks a little similar. I have been creating an entire gemstone collection of table toppers. We've done emerald eyes, we've done the sapphire shimmer, and now we're into the Topaz Treasure. It's summertime here in the Midwest where I live, and that bright yellows just reminds me of all the flowers that are blooming outside. So we're collecting up a bunch of yellow fabrics today for Topaz Treasure. It is so wonderful to see all of you joining me. We've got Bonnie and Diane and Mariana and Pat and Heidi. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to be working with a collection of fabrics, so we're going to do a gradation. So we're going to start with those darker yellow colors, almost into that mustard kind of yellow, and then into a medium. And I did something that didn't have a lot of pattern to it for the medium. Then I went to a light yellow that has a white floral kind of design, kind of makes me think of zinnias and flowers blooming. And then I picked a white with just a little bit of a yellow print to it, just to kind of highlight that color back through the project. Of course, all of your yardages are listed in your pattern, and you also need some binding. So I decided to go with that medium yellow as my binding. And just for fun, you don't have to pick yellow for the back, but I selected a really fun yellow print that has that aqua green background, something fun for the back. So all of your yardages are in your pattern. Now, when it comes to the supplies, you know, we normally need our rotary cutter and our mat, of course. We can use a 8.5 or 8-inch ruler. You can use the 24-inch, but I have a shorter one to use here on the set. And then usually I talk about the Tucker trimmer, but I happen to not bring it with me, so I'm going to show you how to use your normal square, smaller ruler for doing our trimming at the end, because some people say, well, I don't want to invest in a new ruler, so let's make sure that we know how to use the tools that we do have. Other things we'll also need is some kind of fabric marking tool that will show up on the back side of your fabric. I picked a purple so that the camera can pick it up really well today. A 1/4-inch seam marker. If you aren't real confident about where your 1/4-inch seam is yet, well, actually you can use this for actually marking the seam, actual stitching area, or you can use just a ruler to mark a diagonal. I'll demonstrate that in a moment. Best press or some kind of a starch product is always something that if you are worried about distortion in your fabric, using that before you cut your squares is always a really, kind of ensures that the fabric doesn't stretch out of place when you're working. Then of course your scissors, pins, thread for piecing, and your handy iron and pressing surface. So let's get into the cutting portion. These patterns are fun because there's only just a few different dimensions we need to do in order to create all of the pieces in our project. We are going to be cutting 8-inch squares, so we can do 8 at a time triangle squares. We're also going to be cutting 4-inch squares where we are going to make 2 at a time. This depends on the number of the combination of triangle fabrics that we're going to use in our project, and on the next page of the instructions I will point that out. So those are the ones we need. Other than that, the only other dimension we need is something cut for binding, and I cut it at 2.5 in this case. So as I started to create these patterns, I realized if we could do the 8 at a time method, we could make a lot of triangle squares fairly quickly and not have to do those little tiny triangles, joining those, or even 2 at a time. 8 at a time is even better because less cutting means faster, quicker to the sewing machine, and that's my favorite part of the process. Let's see if we've got any questions. We've got hello from Dixie. She's from Denver, Colorado. Thanks for joining me. We've got Linda from Central Texas, and Anne says she's from South Carolina. So we're just going around the country, bringing everybody together today. That's great. Okay, let's work on the 8-inch squares, the 8 at a time triangle square method. Of course, I said that's my favorite method to do here. I have them listed in groups so that when you're going to make the 8 at a time process, it tells you the color combinations to pair up. So that you need to make, for instance, the dark and the medium are going to go together, and you need to do that 2 sets, 2 processes to make 16 half square triangles. I also give them each a letter combination, because if you look at this project, the fabrics are matched up with different mates. Here you would see the medium with the light, and then we have the medium with the white background. Here we have medium with the light yellow. So if we give each of them an ABC, everything we ever needed to know, we learned in kindergarten, our ABCs, then we can code this and then keep those pieces, once you complete them, by their alphabet letter in little stacks, and then you can follow the diagram on page 4 for how to arrange them. So as you make each of the units, note that what letter it's given, keep them together. Even if you don't have time to maybe sew everything at once, put them in a baggie, label the baggie, this is group B, and then go on to the next group, those are all going to be letter C. So that later, when you come back to it, everything's ready to go for you to lay out your table topper. So as we go into the piecing of this, we're going to be working on a medium and a dark fabric. Let's turn it so we have the lightest fabric possible up, and then we can see really well when we go into mark with our fabric marking tool. We're going to mark a diagonal across the block, and we're going to mark it in both directions. And I'm just going to do the center line marking. If you don't feel comfortable stitching a 1/4 inch from that line, then that's where using that 1/4 inch seam marker comes into play. You can also use this tool, lay it across the block. Oh, there we go. Lining up that center line, corner to corner, and mark both sides. That would give you the exact stitching line. And then you would follow those lines as you enter it into the sewing machine. But in this case, I guess after a while you know where your 1/4 inch seam is. I'm also using a 1/4 inch foot on my machine to help me keep it very accurate. And I'm putting pins in here just so that my fabrics don't shift out of place as I am stitching, because the bigger the square becomes, the more chance for some shifting to happen. So close, here we go. Now I've also put on the integrated dual process there, so it really will keep my fabrics nice and neat, one on top of the other. And then we just stitch in both directions. I'm going to go on both sides of that marked line so that I will then be able to cut this apart and make a lot of units at one time. I wish I would have invented this system, but sadly it wasn't me that invented it. I'm not sure who the person who came up with this, but it's a fabulous way to do it. Like I said, the more times you are cutting fabric, the more chances you have for making an error. So if you can create just 2 large squares and yield 8 triangle squares that all match, that's kind of the thing. Sometimes I think, well, why isn't this made with, a process where I can make multiples? It may be the problem that there aren't that many matching units within the project, and then you have to do that in a more traditional fashion. But because we have a lot of matching units, we can use this process really quick. It's kind of like stitching a railroad track across your fabrics. We are stitching at diagonal, which if you were cutting that before you actually stitched it, That's when you can get distortion and a stretch happening. But in this case, we are keeping it whole first and then cutting it later. So last time across, there we go. Nice to have that thread cut mechanism there. We now have all of our stitching done. We can clean up our block a little bit here by taking away stray threads. I tend to be a person who does, trim those away as I work so that I don't have a lot of threads on my finished project later. When I go to long arm, I'm always happy with customers who will trim as they go so that the back side of the quilt is nice and neat and tidy. Okay, now we can press this flat so that, and I used a friction pen. You'll notice my line is disappearing. The friction pen is heat sensitive so that when I press, then the line goes away and all you see is my stitching. Now, the friction pen is nice because it does disappear, but only use it on the back side of fabrics. I would never want to use this on the front because there are chances that if it's not washed, the chemical isn't washed away, that you will get what's called a ghost line. As it cools, sometimes you get just a little bit of a line popping up later, and we don't want that to happen on the front side of your quilt, but on the back side, it's okay to have that there. Nobody will ever see it once it's quilted in. Now, we are going to take this block and we're going to cut it. Let me get it, in the camera angle better. Here we go. We're going to cut this in a variety of ways. We're going to cut down through the center here, a horizon here, and then we're going to cut down through the stitching line itself. Now, the block was 8 inches wide, so that means 4 inches over is the center, and hopefully those crisscross of stitching is right in the center if you stitched accurately. Using a rotating mat so I don't have to disturb my fabrics here. So 4 inches in again from here should be the very center. Now the last 2 cuts are down through the stitching. And I am one that likes to push away and not cut in an odd angle, so this rotating mat, or even if you just have a regular small mat laying on your table that you can turn as you work, out and away is always the safest direction to cut your fabrics. Okay, now when we open this up, we have 8 matching units quickly made in no time. Kind of like getting addicted to potato chips. Making 8 at a time triangle squares is a fun process. Now, making sure that when you go to press, most of the time we suggest that you press, of course, toward the darker fabric. So the darker value, the seam allowances go in that direction. No questions, good deal. That means the explanation must be fairly accurate. I haven't confused anyone yet. Sometimes I like to just hit that first to warm up the fibers and then push out and away so that we get that seam going in one direction. A lot of times when I'm doing this at home, I will just pick up my iron and put the next one on. The heat that's in the ironing board will help warm up those fibers, and then I can just keep going one after the other after the other. And then when I'm finished, make sure that I've got my pieces, the process done twice for the dark yellow and the medium yellow, according to our instructions. These will be alphabet letter B, and I will keep them all together until I get to my layout section. So we've got a whole bunch of these made, so then we have to do the trimming. So we are going to, well, let's see. Let's do the 2 at a time because we once in a while have to create a few more 2 at a time process. And say I would need 20 of the same thing. Well, I can do that process twice and get to 16, but I hate to make extra and waste a lot of pieces. So sometimes we are making 2 at a time triangle squares. So in the 2 at a time method, we are taking our two fabrics. I'm going to use a ruler just for a diagonal here. On the back side of the lighter one, so it's easy to see, draw a diagonal line there. Then we'll be able to do all of our trimming all at once. Sometimes people, oh, I hate to trim, but if you kind of keep them all together, be ready to trim, then you can kind of put on some really good music or listen to a program and do all the trimming at once, and then the time flies. Okay, put this under the machine and make those last two. Again, if you are not comfortable with where your 1/4 inch seam allowance is, you may want to mark both of your stitching lines on your 2 at a time process. And then down the other side. For the longest time, I would mark both of those stitching lines because I just wasn't so confident in my ability to find my 1/4 inch seam. But because we're going to trim these after they're created, we are going to have perfect patchwork. And in your pattern, at the very end, you will find a chart that will assist you in converting a pattern if you find that you like the 2 at a time process or the 8 at a time process. You can then convert any pattern using that chart, at least for blocks within that range, and that will help you create other, use that same method in another project. Once we kind of find that we like a process, we want to use it over and over again, and I thought that maybe you might enjoy having that information for that. Okay, then we need to press these real quick, and you will see that then we have 2 matching triangle squares here. Then we will get to the trimming process. Let's see if we have any other questions. At the end of the program today, we're going to show you more about our sewing machine here and all of its wonderful capabilities. And I'm going to be then, I'll note a little bit about the quilting, but in that video, you will find out information that maybe you would love that machine for machine quilting. There are a lot of quilters who are kind of on the fence of doing their own machine quilting, and this machine has some really great capabilities, so you may want to invest in a machine that will assist you in doing some fabulous machine quilting. It has a projection system that we're going to demo in that video that is a just fabulous addition to our ability to machine quilt like a pro. Now, all of these need to be trimmed up to 3.5 inches. All of the pieces that you're making in this. So I have demoed using the Tucker trimmer before, and it has less lines on it, so it's a little bit easier to read, but you are welcome to use any square ruler. Look for one that has a 45-degree line diagonally across. One thing I like to do when I'm trimming to make sure that I get on the right line is to use a little bit of Glowline tape. It comes in 3 or 4 different colors. You can use painter's tape, you could use a Post-it note, anything that will kind of give you a reference for where you want to be so that you trim all of your blocks accurately. So when we put our ruler on the block, always be looking for that diagonal line to line up right on top of your seam. This trim is going to be like giving it a tiny haircut, okay? Like a Marine who has short hair, but it has to be always kept perfect. So we're just going to do a nice trim around this block. So do 2 sides at a time. Up one side, across the top. There we go. So we're trimming just a little bit off. And some people will say, but is that enough to really make a difference? It is. That little bit ensures that when you are putting block to block, and then joining rows, that you have perfectly matched seams and everything fits together nicely. This is also a method that's great to use if you're doing maybe a joint project with a lot of quilters. I know there's quilters out there who are like, I would really like to make a project and have either some new sewers or even new quilters or older quilters, people who've been quilting a long time, join me. But not all of our seam allowances are exactly the same 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this method, because you have to be very honest at the end to trim everything up, makes that patchwork something that then you can join together many different quilters' patchwork and everything would fit. So this is a method you may want to employ if you're doing maybe a round robin project with quilters where everybody's adding pieces to another quilter's project. This way everything would fit nicely and be very accurate. So we just create that little bit of trim on all of our pieces. So sometimes quilters will say, I don't want to waste fabric. Well, this really isn't much waste, that's for sure. So now when you put blocks side by side, you will see how perfect they will fit together and join into nice rows. Okay, so we have covered the 8 at a time process. We've covered the 2 at a time process. Remember that the chart has how many of each processes you need to do. So you've got your 8 at a time process, you've got your 2 at a time process there. And then in highlight, it reminds you to trim all of your pieces to 3.5 inches. Then it's basically following your ABCs and putting together the design. The fun part about the Topaz version was I would love to see the star pop out of this design. The shimmer, the sapphire shimmer, and the emerald eyes patterns, maybe we can maybe put in those links for those patterns too if you haven't seen them before. Very similar, but each one of them has a little different nuance. You see something pop out of the design in those different versions. Then we also give you instructions on pressing, so that in row 1, we ask you to press all of your seam allowances as you join block to block, to the right, next row to the left, down through, so that when you will have opposing seams as you join your pieces together. And of course that chart at the end that will give you the ability to convert any pattern that you are wanting to make. If it has that repetition of matching units, you can use these different charts to convert any pattern to a quick process to create really great blocks. Remember, those are all in the trim version, so that tells you that then it needs to be trimmed down to a certain size. So the Topaz Treasure is the quilt that we are focusing on today. So let's look real quick at the quilting, because quilters are always like, I have a top, but now I don't know what to do with it. So on this quilt, instead of doing free motion circles and things, I decided to do a little bit more straight line quilting, which then gave motion to the quilt in these angles that kind of mimic the angles within, but aren't parallel lines. They're kind of a ripple effect in the quilting. I put a star in the very center and then let everything ripple out from there. Now, when you see the ad for the creative icon, there is a projection system in this sewing machine that will put a grid down on your fabric. It's just shining a light down on it so that you can do straight line quilting, lining it up with seams within your block, and you can create some fabulous designs. Let's see if we have any other questions. Let's see. Have you ever used the trick with an iron to make your center line? A trick with the iron. Oh, is this a fold press to give it a line? That works as long as you have really great eyes. Here's what I'm assuming you mean, is to take a block and fold it, and then give a light pressing line here, and then open that up and use the pressed line as your guide. Yes, that would work. You have to have good lighting and really young eyes, I'm afraid. So that's a possibility for some quilters. That's a really good trick though. Thanks for adding that for us. Linda asks, what are you using for your pressing board? The pressing board is a Omnigrid that has a pressing on one side and a cutting mat on the other, and it's a travel kind of board. I use this when I travel and I teach. I have a big pressing board at home. Make sure that your pressing board isn't too soft. Make sure there isn't too much padding underneath. It needs to be a fairly stiff board so that it gives a nice press to your seam allowances. Good question. Good catch. I think at this point, we will now see what we can find and learn about the PFAFF Creative Icon 2. The PFAFF company has been creating sewing machines for 150 years. They've got technology that was only in our dreams years ago. That wish list of all the capabilities, they've taken that list and they have accomplished it. They have created a wonderful AI technology that is within the machine. So as we look to what can be done, the sewing machine now has this wonderful tablet with information here in the top right-hand corner that tells us what presser foot to put onto our machine. So when we attach it, it knows what one we've put on. As I put on the presser foot, it will tell me, it will give you a recommendation that it's the OA sewing presser foot, and that's the one I've attached. Each one of the presser feet that comes with the machine has a code, and the machine knows which one you've taken off and put on. So we have the OA attached here. It also will have the integrated dual feed that can easily be attached by just bringing it down, attaching it to it. No more putting on an attachment to the machine or having to find something that just kind of works. This one works perfectly every time. Easily just attached and detached whenever you're needing to go through thicknesses or working on a dense design. So if we pop off this foot, let's see what other things the machine knows in advance. As we put on the most commonly used foot for quilters, the 1/4 inch foot, that's kind of always our go-to. We're always looking for that perfect 1/4 inch. The sewing machine now says the 1/4 inch quilting foot has been attached to the machine. If we want to use that integrated dual feed, it's available to pop down and put into position. Then there are, of course, a myriad of sewing machine feet that come with our machine. The zipper foot is one that we are using for bags and pouches. We don't use it a lot, but when we do, it's a really great feature. As we attach this to the machine, and I said that each one of them is coded, that that number 4 code on the zipper foot will then pop up on our screen, the number 4 zipper foot. It also tells us the position. We've got the left justified here. If I simply pop this off and move it to the side, we'll have the right justified. No more having to adjust needles when putting on a foot for zipper application. Now, if for some reason I would accidentally decide to put this on and not look at the numbering system and put it on the wrong way, the machine, of course, is smart. It pops up with a red warning that I've incorrectly attached the foot. So don't sew that direction. Make the machine happy and make yourself happy and flip it around. Now, we are going to be looking at some of the stitches available on the new PFAFF Creative Icon 2. The PFAFF Creative Icon 2 has a new set of stitches, those that are extra wide. In the past, we've always said, you have stitches, but they're narrow. How do we use them? Now that wish list is expanded, and now we have a new set of maxi stitches. As we go into the stitch capability of the machine, we can expand the screen so that we can see everything that's in each of our choices. Of course, there's even files within that, so what you see, there's more beyond that. Let's go into needle art. These are some of the more embroidery-like stitches, but then there are some wonderful ones that we would possibly be using maybe for a crazy quilt. Look at all the possibilities here. Let's go into one that is one of those maxi stitches that is extra wide. It will stitch an entire inch wide design. So let's select this design, and then we're going to, whoops, let's see if I can move the page over, and you can see that the design that I selected has popped up on the screen, and it appears in the actual size that it will stitch out. No more wondering how big is that stitch actually going to be and what's the proportion in detail. It comes up in the actual size. It can be played with, but the proportion here looks very nice. So let's decide, see what this actually will look like on my fabric. So I can touch the little projector icon, and we will see that as I turn on the projector will give me an image here on the sewing machine bed. But before I turn it on, just so you know, in sewing machines and lighting, it used to be that you had to go find the features or the settings of your machine, and you had to go off in a different direction to adjust the lighting. PFAFF was listening. Why go looking for that when I want to adjust the lighting as I approach my stitch? They've now put on the LED work light right there so that as I touch to turn on or off, the overhead lighting goes down because now the projector comes up. This is what we're going to have fun watching stitch out. The projector has a grid that can be adjusted depending on the stitch density or size you want to create and how you're going to be using it. So at first we've got our design that comes up within that, and I've adjusted that grid just a tiny bit. Let's see. The default on that was at the 10 millimeter, so you can see a small green grid laying on my fabric. You also see a red projection line, which is the center of the actual stitch 13 that I selected. Now we see it in real time, real size here on the fabric before we even stitch it out, making sure that it fits possibly within the parameters that we want to use it. Maybe I want to use it in a sashing on a quilt, so I can then make sure that I center it properly. If I want to repeat this design, it can be, I can adjust the grid so that my design fits right between two of those grids. Then when I go to repeat it, I'll know exactly by using that same grid over and over, I can space it properly. We also have the options for changing the projection background and the color of the projection itself. The white is set right now as the default, which works on this gray nicely so that it doesn't disrupt. But depending on the color of your fabric, you may want to select something else. The fun part here is if I were working on a green fabric, maybe that green grid isn't quite what I want. So I can come into the settings. I could change it to a fun blue. And now it's a blue-purple color. Now that grid color comes up for me to use. Depending on your eyes, the color of the fabric you're working on, or even the pattern, you can adjust that grid to be the most visible, the most useful for you. Now, the other thing that we can do is that we can come into the stitch guide. Now that's bright red. If you happen to be working on a red fabric, a red guide wouldn't help you, would it? So we can adjust that also. We have the in order to select something that works best for us. If I put it on, I get a blue-purple line there. Red works really well on gray, so let's go back to the red. Now, as I want to close this a little bit here. Each of the drop downs and all those possibilities do have ways of closing it up so it kind of closes everything. So you don't have to have all of it on the screen at once. And I can then move it up and out of the way so that I can see just the things that I want to work with here. Let's close that up, and it will center my design. There's a crosshair at the beginning, so it tells me where the stitching will begin, and actually it's going to go backward a little, and then it's going to continuously do this design. So let's have a little fun and stitch a design. It may be a little hard to see at first, but the machine is moving backward and forward and side to side. It has basically stitch in every direction so that the projected design goes away while you're stitching, so that you are focused on the actual stitching itself. And as it steps from side to side, you'll notice how wide this maxi design actually is. How fun to see stitching come to life. I can imagine this as a detail on a little kid's quilt who loves dump trucks. Wouldn't a 3-year-old squeal when he saw that there were tracks across his quilt? Okay, when we finish, we've got thread cut so that we can take it out of our machine, and it delivers a beautiful stitch made by our creative Icon 2. Making patchwork is so much fun, but quilting the quilt is a step we need to work at too. As quilters in the past, we've always gone to rulers and marking for doing channel quilting, but gone are those days. PFAFF is listening. They've created a projection system that will assist you to make perfect channel quilting, cross-hatching. The possibilities are endless. Let's see what we've got. When we bring up our projection system with our stitching, I've got it set for just a simple straight stitch so that I can do some simple channel quilting. I've got my work light on so that it's dimmed a little on this side so that it's going to show my projection here on my fabric. So I've got the black background, which works in most cases, but depending on your fabric, you can change that up a little. Then I've got my setting for the grid. Now, a lot of times a bright green will work, but I picked this really wonderful busy fabric. So we've changed that grid projection color to kind of a light gray kind of color. So let's do some channel quilting on this placemat. We've got the grid coming up here, and the grid defaults at a 10 millimeter spacing in both directions. Now, the machine automatically goes to the metric system. That's its first language, but it also has the ability to switch over to inches. So if you prefer inches, all it is a quick tap and you can change that. We are going to space that grid then. As I move up the size, we can increase that grid to the 25 millimeter, which would be 1 inch. And we can then go into channel quilt across this project. Now we've got dual feed that we can, the integrated dual feed that we can activate because we're working on layers. We want to make sure that we feed that properly through the machine and we don't get any shifting in our quilt sandwich. Now, in order to line this up, I am going to bring my piecing portion from my blocks to the floral fabric to one side. I'm going to use that piecing line to line up with one of the grids on the projection, knowing that then the needle is 1 inch from that seam line. As I line it up, then I can just, instead of watching the needle, because the sewing machine knows how to sew without you watching the needle, all I need to do is concentrate on that projection line, making sure that that grid follows my seam line across my project. How fun is this? Spending time marking quilt projects, getting chalk all over our machine on the presser foot. Now all we have to do is follow that projection line and we get perfect straight lines. Now we'll just snip there so we can go back and line it up for the channel quilting, and you'll then see automatically as I go back to the beginning, now I just move my project over to the left, put the projection line or the grid line on the previous row of stitching, and I'm off and quilting. How fun is that? Now, I can go ahead and do just a channel quilting like this. Maybe I really want to get fancy and I want to do a a complete grid like cross-hatching, and I want to make little boxes. I could rotate my project, use that grid again to line it up with my piecing or a stitching line. They should all match up right on top of each other. Now I could do a perfect 1-inch grid by lining up my guide here with my seam, and it should, if I can drive straight, should be very close to my previous stitches, and then I can stitch in the opposite direction. We are going to get you quilting like a pro in no time. PFAFF has taken embroidery to a whole new level. Let's see what's available today. When we go into the embroidery portion of the machine, it will bring up a drop down along the side that has a lot of different possibilities. One thing is to go to the internet. The computer in this sewing machine will hook to your Wi-Fi, and you can go to the SewNet, which you can create an account, where then you can have a blog delivered right to your sewing machine every week. You can learn about new things that are coming out, new ideas. You can also find an entire list of projects along with patterns and all the details that come right into your sewing machine. No longer are you looking for that little thumb drive so that you can transfer things from one place to another. It comes directly to your sewing machine. Once you have had some fun with the SewNet account and what's available there, let's look at some of the things that deal with embroidery. So we have a wonderful set of stitches out there. There are hundreds of stitches available. Some are PFAFF exclusive, some wonderful designs, but there are a whole variety of designs that you can play with. Today we're going to select just a simple little flower design. Comes up here on our screen so that we know exactly what the detail will look like. Then we can turn on our projection and put that on. Our sewing machine is getting smart. It knows it needs to adjust. When we go to put the hoop on our machine, we've got, of course, our fabric and our stabilizer all prepared. And we need to select the size to match to the hoop that we're using. So in the options, it gives us a drop down of all of the different sizes that are available to use, clear up to the 360 by 350, down as small as 80 by 80. So we are going to select the 120 by 120, the hoop we're going to use in this process. And then we are going to let's select our design. Everything's getting ready for us. It tells us to go ahead and attach our hoop. Simply slide it into place until we hear the click. There we go. Now the hoop is in position. It's so smart that it's helping us all along the way. Now we can put on a projection onto our fabric so that we can see the exact location and lining things up with the project we want to create. Here I'm going to change the background to a bright green so we can have a really good visualization of the area that we can stitch in. We want to move our design around in that area so you can see a little bit of the design that I had selected. Let's close this up for now. And let's look just at the design. I can go in and resize this design, by pulling on the corner. I can tap on it and move it as we watch in the green field here so that we can put that design exactly where we want. In the past, you had to hoop everything perfectly square, aligned it just right. Now you have a projected area. You know exactly where your design is going to land. Now, say I like this design, but I wanted maybe to play with the arrangement just a little bit more. I have the capability of, there we go, of tilting my design so my little flower can rock and roll until it's perfectly placed. Maybe I want to do a mirror image of them stem to stem. This way I can adjust them perfectly. So I've got my design that I can move about. If the portion in the hoop at this point where my design is at, if I want to move that, I can also bring up the ability to, as it thinks, you can see the dots there, it can move the hoop and my design in real time right here in front of me so that I can create the perfect embroidery. No more guessing, the guesswork's gone. The projection helps me create exactly what I would like to see happen in my stitching. There you have it. Let your creativity flourish with the Creative Icon 2 PFAFF sewing machine.